It was 1940. Europe was on its knees. Adolf Hitler, the man who had promised a 1,000-year empire, picked up a report from a mahogany table. The paper detailed the industrial capacity of the United States of America. He glanced at a single number, a figure for automobile production, and a smirk played on his lips. It was a look of pure, unadulterated contempt. "Look at this," he said, his voice laced with amusement. He let the paper fall from his fingers, fluttering to the floor like a dead leaf. "They build cars and refrigerators. They are a nation of shopkeepers, not warriors." The room, filled with the architects of the most terrifying war machine the world had ever seen, erupted in sycophantic laughter. The sound echoed off the cold marble walls, a chilling symphony of arrogance. To them, America was a distant, lazy giant, fat with comfort and asleep in a dream of peace. A nation that had lost its nerve, still nursing the wounds of a Great Depression, whose army was a joke, ranking 17th in the world, just behind Portugal. Their tanks were flimsy, their soldiers untested, their will to fight non-existent. From the heart of the Third Reich, the smokestacks of Detroit and Pittsburgh didn't look like forges of war. They looked like monuments to a soft, decadent lifestyle. Hitler and his command were convinced. They believed they had years, an entire ocean of time, before America could even think about challenging them. By then, the war would be over. The world would be theirs. This was his ultimate betrayal, not of a person, but of an entire nation's spirit. A deep, cutting dismissal. He didn't just underestimate America's power, he mocked its very soul. But in that moment of triumphant laughter, a seed was planted. A seed of vengeance. Not the hot, quick vengeance of a single man, but a cold, slow, grinding revenge. A revenge that wouldn't be enacted with a dagger in the dark, but with gears, with steel, with 1,000,000 working hands, and with an avalanche of fire and fury that would rise from the very factories he so arrogantly dismissed. He laughed at their factories. He had no idea those factories were about to become the anvils where the hammers of his destruction would be forged, and the sound of those hammers would soon drown out his laughter forever. Across the Atlantic, the giant was indeed sleeping, but it was a restless sleep, plagued by nightmares from a war fought a generation ago. America didn't want another conflict. The country was tired, its bones weary from economic collapse. The quiet hum of its factories was a sound of recovery, not rearmament. The tanks they had were few, and frankly pathetic. The M2 light tank, a machine so flimsy it was more of a death trap than a weapon. The US military was a shadow, a relic of past glories with no appetite for future wars. The spirit of isolationism was a thick, heavy blanket, comforting and suffocating at the same time. Let Europe deal with its own demons, the sentiment went. We have our own to fight right here at home. And Hitler saw this. He saw the protests for peace, the politicians who argued for neutrality, the headlines that spoke of domestic troubles, not foreign wars. He saw weakness, indecision, and a fatal lack of will. His intelligence reports confirmed it all. The Americans were soft, they couldn't unite, they wouldn't fight. But then, on a quiet Sunday morning in December 1941, the sky over Pearl Harbor was torn open. Fire rained down, ships twisted into grotesque sculptures of burning steel, and in a few short hours, the debate was over. The blanket of isolationism was ripped away, not gently but violently. The sleeping giant didn't just stir. It was jolted awake by a profound sense of violation and betrayal. President Franklin D. Roosevelt, his voice calm but his words carrying the weight of a coming storm, addressed a nation gripped by shock and fury. He didn't just declare war, he declared something more. He called upon the nation to become a great arsenal of democracy. It wasn't a call to arms, it was a call to work, a call to turn every factory, every assembly line, every ounce of American ingenuity into a weapon. And in that moment, the revenge plot began. It wasn't written down in a secret dossier. It was written in the sparks of welding torches, in the grease-stained hands of factory workers, and in the determined eyes of a nation that had just been told it wasn't good enough. The laughter from that marble hall in Berlin had finally reached American shores, and it was no longer funny. It was a challenge. The shopkeepers, the mechanics, the farmers, the men and women Hitler had mocked, rolled up their sleeves. They weren't soldiers yet. They were something far more dangerous. They were builders, and they were about to build a reckoning. The instrument of this revenge wouldn't be a sleek, perfect weapon born of military genius. German engineering prided itself on creating mechanical masterpieces, the Tiger, the Panther, tanks that were like handcrafted, magnificent beasts of prey. They were powerful, deadly, and terrifyingly complex. They were built to be superior. But America wasn't going to play that game. Instead, a team of designers, working under immense pressure, laid out the blueprints for something different. Something American. It was the medium tank M4. The world would come to know it as the Sherman. On paper, it was nothing special. Its armor was decent, but not the thickest. Its gun was adequate, but not the most powerful. It wasn't the fastest, nor the most agile. To a German tank commander, comparing its specifications to his Panther would have been laughable. It was a compromise on every level. But the Germans missed the point. The Sherman wasn't designed to be the best tank in a one-on-one duel. It was designed to be the best tank for winning a war. Its genius was not in its individual strength, but in its collective might. It was designed for three things that Germany's masterpiece tanks could never compete with. First, mass production. The Sherman was deliberately simple. Its parts were interchangeable. It could be assembled by workers who, just weeks earlier, had been building cars or tractors. Its engine was a modified aircraft radial engine, something America already knew how to build by the thousands. Second, reliability. While German Tigers and Panthers were notorious for breaking down, their complex transmissions and engines groaning under their own weight, the Sherman was a workhorse. It just kept going. And if it did break down, it was so simple that a crew with a basic toolkit and a bit of training could often fix it right there in the mud and the chaos of the front lines. And third, logistics. Every Sherman that rolled off the assembly line was part of a system. It came with a steady supply of spare parts, fuel and ammunition that followed it across the ocean and onto the battlefield. The Revenge wasn't just the tank itself. It was the entire industrial ecosystem that gave it life. While Germany was building exquisite high-maintenance predators, America was preparing to unleash a swarm of rugged, dependable and utterly relentless machines. The blueprints were approved, the orders were sent out. From the boardrooms of General Motors to the factory floors of Chrysler, a quiet, determined hum began. It was the sound of a nation turning its industrial might, the very thing Hitler had laughed at, into a weapon. The Revenge was taking shape, not in a general's mind, but on the assembly line, and it was going to be built by the tens of thousands. The hum became a roar. What happened next in America was not just manufacturing. It was a miracle of will and scale that the world had never seen before and may never see again. The nation didn't just build tanks, it transformed itself. Car factories in Detroit, masters of the assembly line, didn't just retool, they were reborn. The same lines that once gracefully assembled shiny new Cadillacs were now violently birthing olive-drab monsters of steel. Chrysler's Detroit Arsenal, a facility built from scratch in less than a year, began churning out Shermans at a horrifying rate. At its peak, a brand-new, battle-ready M4 Sherman was rolling off its assembly line every 49 minutes. Think about that. Not one a day. Not one every few hours. One tank, complete with its engine, its cannon, and its 500,000 parts, was born every single hour of every single day of every single week. But it wasn't just the auto giants. Small factories, the kind that made kitchen appliances or farm equipment, were given blueprints and told to start making tank treads or gun mounts or turret rings. The locomotive companies, with their expertise in heavy steel, started welding the hulls. A river of parts, sourced from every corner of the country, flowed into the main assembly plants. This was the Revenge of the shopkeepers, and it was powered by people, by men too old to fight and boys too young to be drafted. And most of all by women, millions of them. They left their homes and kitchens, tied up their hair in bandanas and learned to weld, to rivet, to operate massive hydraulic presses. Rosie the Riveter wasn't just a poster, she was the force multiplier. Her hands, once used to knead dough, were now building the machines that would break an empire. Across the ocean, German intelligence received the reports. The numbers were astronomical, unbelievable. 10,000 tanks, 20,000, 30,000. They dismissed them as fantasy, as crude American propaganda. No nation on earth could produce on that scale. It was impossible. It defied all logic, all principles of engineering and production. Their own Tiger tank took weeks to assemble, a painstaking process involving master craftsmen. The idea that unskilled workers could stamp out tanks like cookies was to them an insult to the art of war. And so, even as the evidence mounted, the laughter in Berlin continued, albeit a little more forced now. They were still confident. After all, what good was a mountain of mediocre tanks against their handful of invincible ones? They were about to find out. The first Shermans to taste battle arrived in the blistering deserts of North Africa in late 1942. For the American crews, young men fresh from training grounds in Georgia and California, this was the moment of truth. They were nervous, but confident. They were in a brand new American tank, ready to face the legendary Afrika Korps. The first encounters were a brutal, painful lesson. The Sherman's gun, the initial 75mm, struggled to penetrate the frontal armour of the newer German Panzer IVs, let alone the mythical Tigers that were just beginning to appear. Meanwhile, the German guns, with their superior velocity and accuracy, could slice through the Sherman's armour from a terrifying distance. Crews quickly discovered their tank's most horrifying flaw. When hit in the right spot, the ammunition stored inside the hull had a tendency to ignite, turning the tank into an inferno in seconds. The Germans gave it a cynical, terrifying nickname, the Tommy Cooker. British crews, who also used the Sherman, morbidly joked that it was like a Ronson lighter. It lit up first time, every time. The betrayal felt sharp and immediate. Had they been sent out here to die in these rolling coffins? Was this the great weapon that was supposed to win the war? For a moment, in the dust and fire of the Tunisian desert, it seemed Hitler's laughter had been justified. The shopkeepers had built a flawed machine. Their revenge seemed to be blowing up in their own faces. German propaganda seized on it, broadcasting images of burning Shermans as proof of American incompetence. The losses were heavy. The morale of the tank crews wavered. They felt like they were in a fistfight with a man who had a much longer reach. But what the Germans didn't see, what they couldn't comprehend, was what happened after the battle. While a knocked-out Tiger was often a permanent loss, a monument to its own defeat, a disabled Sherman was something else entirely. It was a problem to be solved, and America was very, very good at solving problems. This is where the true nature of the American revenge began to reveal itself. It wasn't just about the tank, it was about the thinking behind it. While the Germans worshipped the idea of the single superior warrior, the Americans embraced the power of the team. First, there was the brutal, undeniable math. For every Tiger tank Germany produced, America produced over 100 Shermans. So when a Sherman crew encountered a Tiger, they weren't expected to fight a noble duel. That was suicide. Their job was to call for help, and help always came. This was the Sherman's second secret weapon, the radio. Nearly every Sherman came equipped with a crystal-clear, reliable two-way radio. It was a piece of technology the Germans, with their inconsistent and often inferior equipment, simply could not match. An American tank platoon didn't fight as 5 individual tanks. They fought as a single, coordinated organism. The commander of the lead tank would spot the Tiger. Tiger at 2 o'clock, 800 yards, he'd calmly broadcast. Immediately, the other 4 Shermans knew what to do. They wouldn't charge head-on. They'd spread out, using their superior mobility to flank the German behemoth. 1 or 2 might act as bait, drawing the Tiger's fire, while the others raced to get a shot at its weaker side or rear armour. The Tiger, with its slow turret traverse, could only face 1 threat at a time. It was like a giant being swarmed by angry wolves. It might take down 1, maybe even 2, but the pack would eventually bring it down. They didn't fight duels, they hunted. And then there was the third, and perhaps most important, piece of the revenge, the miracle of repair. American recovery vehicles, giant armoured tow trucks, would brave enemy fire to drag damaged Shermans back from the front line. At makeshift depots just miles behind the fighting, teams of mechanics, they called themselves grease monkeys, would descend upon the crippled tanks. They worked with a frantic, organised energy. A burnt-out engine could be swapped for a new one in a few hours. A damaged track could be replaced overnight. A Sherman that was a smouldering wreck on Monday could be back on the front line, with a fresh coat of paint and a new crew, by Thursday. To the Germans, this was witchcraft. They would destroy a tank, see it burn, and assume it was gone forever. Then, days later, they'd face what looked like a whole new battalion. Their own losses were permanent. Their prized Tigers, when they broke down, often had to be abandoned and blown up by their own crews because there were no spare parts, no recovery vehicles strong enough, and no time to fix their delicate, over-engineered systems. The laughter in Berlin was growing faint. The joke was starting to wear thin. They were beginning to understand. They weren't just fighting a tank. They were fighting a factory. A relentless, unending assembly line that stretched all the way from Detroit to the heart of the battlefield. And it was an assembly line that never, ever stopped. The whispers of Tommy Cooker and Ronson were a ghost that haunted every American tank crew. It was a betrayal felt deep in the gut. The fear that the machine meant to protect you was itself a fire trap. This was the moment the entire Sherman project could have failed. This was where the German laughter could have found its final grim validation. But the American way wasn't to discard a flawed tool. It was to fix it. Fast. Back in the factories and design offices, the reports from the front lines weren't filed away. They were treated as emergencies. The engineers, the men in lab coats and glasses, felt the heat of those burning tanks from thousands of miles away. They worked with a desperate urgency, not just to improve a machine, but to save the lives of the young men operating it. Their solution was brilliantly simple. It was called wet storage. They redesigned the ammunition racks, surrounding them with water jackets. If a shell pierced the armor and hit the ammunition, the water would flood the compartment, dousing the fire before it could start. It didn't make the tank invincible, but it gave the crew something they desperately needed. Time. Time to get out. This one change, implemented on the fly in the middle of a world war, transformed the Sherman. It exorcised the ghost. Crews began to trust their tanks again. They knew it could still be knocked out, but it wouldn't necessarily become their tomb. And the revenge evolved. The factories didn't just keep building more. They started building better. A new, more powerful 76mm gun was developed, one that could finally punch back effectively against the German Panthers. They added thicker armor where it was needed most. They improved the suspension. The Sherman was a living weapon, constantly learning, adapting, and growing stronger, fed by the harsh lessons of the battlefield. Each new, improved model that landed on the shores of Europe was another nail in the coffin of German arrogance. They had mocked a machine, but the machine was listening, and it was getting angrier. If the Sherman tank was the instrument of revenge, then its high priest was General George S. Patton. He was a man who seemed forged from the same elements as the tanks he commanded, loud, aggressive, covered in grit, and relentlessly moving forward. He didn't see the Sherman's flaws. He saw its soul. He saw its potential for speed, for shock, for a new kind of warfare that would beat the Germans at their own game, the Blitzkrieg. Patton didn't want the perfect tank. He wanted the tank he could have right now, and he wanted thousands of them. In a now famous exchange, when an ordnance officer tried to sell him on the idea of waiting for a more powerful, heavier tank, Patton exploded. He didn't have time to wait for perfection. He needed to kill the enemy today. He understood the American doctrine better than anyone. An imperfect plan violently executed now is better than a perfect plan next week. The Sherman was his imperfect plan, and he intended to execute it with all the violence he could muster. His Third Army became a torrent of steel, with Shermans at its leading edge. They didn't lumber, they charged. Patton pushed his crews and their machines to the absolute limit. He drove them through mud, through forests, through shelled-out towns, often outrunning his own supply lines. His philosophy was simple: never stop, never let the enemy rest, never let them regroup. He famously declared, "My men can eat their belts, but my tanks gotta have gas." And the Shermans delivered. They were reliable enough to keep up with his insane pace. They were mobile enough to exploit every breakthrough. When they drove into a French town, the sound of their engines was the sound of liberation. To the German soldiers trying to retreat, the unending rumble of hundreds of Sherman tracks on the horizon was the sound of doom. Patton's armoured columns became a spear, with the industrial might of America as its shaft, aimed directly at the heart of the Third Reich. He was the human embodiment of the factory's revenge. A furious, unstoppable force of will, leading an army of machines that Hitler had laughed at just a few years before. And now, that army was at Germany's doorstep. Patton's spear would have shattered without one of the greatest logistical feats in human history, the Red Ball Express. This was the unseen army, the secret weapon that made the entire revenge possible. After the D-Day landings in Normandy, the Allied armies broke out and began their race across France. They moved so fast that traditional supply lines based on railways and ports were left hopelessly behind. The tanks were running out of fuel, the guns were running out of shells, the soldiers were running out of food. The entire offensive was in danger of grinding to a halt. The solution was a highway dedicated entirely to military supplies. A continuous 24/7 loop of trucks running day and night from the beaches of Normandy to the front lines. They called it the Red Ball Express. The drivers of these trucks were the unsung heroes of the war. The vast majority of them were African-American soldiers, men who were denied the right to fight in combat units due to the segregated policies of the time. They were given the unglamorous, back-breaking job of driving, and they turned it into an act of breathtaking heroism. They drove in darkness, with no headlights to avoid attracting enemy aircraft. They drove on roads shattered by bombs and littered with mines. They drove until their eyes burned from lack of sleep, subsisting on coffee and sheer grit. They faced sniper fire, ambushes, and the constant threat of mechanical failure. But they never stopped. This was the river of life that fed the flood of Shermans. Each truck was a drop of blood, carrying the fuel, the ammunition, and the spare parts that kept Patton's army moving. They were delivering, quite literally, the vengeance forged in American factories. A captured German general, when interrogated, expressed his utter disbelief. He couldn't understand how the Americans advanced so quickly. "We would blow up a bridge," he said, his voice a mixture of frustration and awe, "and we assumed it would stop your advance for weeks. We would return the next day, and there would be a new bridge, and your tanks would already be across it. We could not comprehend the speed of your engineers or the endless supply of your fuel." He paused, then added the line that perfectly captured the dawning horror in the German High Command. "You don't have a supply line, you have a supply system. It is a machine, and we don't know how to fight a machine." The laughter from the marble hall was now a distant, hollow echo. It had been replaced by the unending, thunderous rumble of the Red Ball Express, a sound that to the German army was the very sound of their world coming to an end. They were being buried, not just by tanks, but by an avalanche of gasoline, tires, and ammunition crates, all delivered by men they had never even considered to be part of the fight. By the autumn of 1944, the situation had inverted completely. The German war machine, once the sleek, terrifying predator, was now starving. Its tanks sat idle, not for lack of courage, but for lack of fuel. Its factories, hammered day and night by Allied bombers also built in the factories Hitler had mocked, could no longer replace losses. Every German tank destroyed was a wound that would not heal. The American war machine, meanwhile, had become a monstrosity of abundance. It was an avalanche in slow motion, a relentless, grinding force that was burying the Third Reich under its own weight. And the Sherman was the tip of that avalanche. The sheer number of them was a psychological weapon. A German panzer crew might knock out a Sherman in a desperate, skillful duel. They might feel a fleeting moment of victory, but as the smoke cleared, they would see 2 more cresting the hill, and behind them 3 more, and behind them the rumble of a dozen more. It was a feeling of utter hopelessness. It wasn't a battle anymore. It was an exercise in futility. It was like trying to empty the ocean with a bucket. The story of the Battle of Aracourt in September 1944 perfectly illustrates this. A German panzer brigade, equipped with their superior and feared Panther tanks, launched a surprise counterattack against an American armored division. On paper, the Germans should have dominated. The Panther was, tank for tank, a better machine than the Sherman. But the battle wasn't fought on paper. The Americans, using their superior numbers, their radio coordination, and the rolling terrain, swarmed the German force. They used wolfpack tactics, with some Shermans drawing fire while others maneuvered for side shots. They called in air support from P-47 Thunderbolts, another product of the American industrial beast, which rained down fire from above. In a matter of days, the elite German Panzer Brigade was shattered. They had lost over 80 tanks, many of them their invincible Panthers. The Americans had lost fewer than 30 Shermans, and many of those were recovered, repaired, and back in action within a week. The German commander of the attacking force, in his after-action report, wrote with a tone of sheer desperation, "We are facing an enemy who replaces his losses in hours, while we cannot replace ours in months. Every engagement, even a victorious one, is a net loss for us. We are bleeding to death." The revenge was no longer about a single tank or a single battle. It was systemic. It was the revenge of a system of production against a system of perfectionism. And the system of production was winning. Decisively. In December 1944, Hitler made one last desperate gamble. He gathered the last of his elite panzer divisions, the last of his fuel reserves, and threw them into a massive surprise offensive through the Ardennes forest. The world would call it the Battle of the Bulge. It was his final defiant roar. For a few days, it seemed to work. The attack caught the Allies by surprise. American lines buckled. The weather was terrible, grounding the all-powerful Allied Air Force. The German Tiger II, or King Tiger, tanks the most powerful of the war, smashed through American defences. This was the ultimate test. It was Germany's best, their last remaining strength, thrown against the American front line. At the key town of Bastogne, the 101st Airborne Division was surrounded, famously replying nuts to a German demand for surrender. But they couldn't hold out forever. They needed relief. They needed armour. And the armour came. Patton, in a feat of tactical brilliance and logistical muscle, turned his entire Third Army 90 degrees and sent them racing north through the snow and ice to relieve Bastogne. And leading the charge, their engines roaring in the freezing air, were the Shermans. They were everywhere. They clogged every road, their steel tracks chewing up the frozen mud. They fought desperate, brutal battles in the fog-shrouded forests. They took heavy losses against the giant King Tigers, but they just kept coming. When the skies finally cleared, the final act of the tragedy for Germany played out. American fighter bombers, the Jabos, swarmed the skies, hunting the German tanks, which were now stuck on icy roads, out of fuel and exposed. A German tank commander from the 1st SS Panzer Division, captured during the battle, was interrogated. He was an arrogant young officer, a true believer, but his arrogance was gone, replaced by a hollow-eyed exhaustion. "We were told we were invincible," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "But you Americans, you have no concept of the impossible. We run out of fuel, and you seem to have oceans of it. We lose a tank, and it is a tragedy. You lose a tank, and there is another one waiting. It is not warfare. It is industry. You are not soldiers. You are a factory that has come to kill us." The Battle of the Bulge was the death rattle of the German army. Hitler's last laugh had been choked out in the snows of the Ardennes, silenced by the thunder of thousands of Sherman tanks, machines he had once dismissed with a wave of his hand. In the spring of 1945, American and Soviet forces met at the Elbe River. The war in Europe was effectively over. Shermans rolled through the rubble of what was once the 1,000-year Reich. They passed by the bombed-out shells of German factories, now silent and dead. They passed by columns of German soldiers, no longer proud warriors, just tired, hungry men walking into captivity. The journey was complete. The revenge was total. It wasn't a story of a single heroic act, but of a million small acts of defiance, of work, of production. It was the revenge of the assembly line worker in Detroit, the engineer in Ohio, the truck driver on the Red Ball Express, and the young tank crewman from Texas, who trusted the flawed but faithful machine that carried him into battle. When the war ended, the American factories didn't celebrate. They just quietly switched gears. The same plants that had produced tanks by the thousands started almost overnight to produce cars again. The roar of war was replaced by the hum of peace. The river of steel that had flooded Europe was diverted back into the channels of commerce. The ultimate testament to the American industrial revenge was this. In 1946, just 1 year after the war, America was producing shiny new Fords, Chevrolets and Chryslers for its returning soldiers. Germany was still trying to clear the rubble. Hitler had laughed because he thought America's strength, its consumer-driven capitalist industry, was its greatest weakness in war. He could not have been more wrong. It was its greatest weapon. It was the very thing that allowed it to absorb a punch, get back up, and deliver a knockout blow of unimaginable force. He had betrayed the spirit of an entire nation with his mockery, and that nation had responded not with angry words, but with a tidal wave of steel that washed his empire away. After the surrender, Allied intelligence officers began the long process of interrogating the captured leaders of the Third Reich. They spoke to generals, to field marshals, to armaments ministers. They were expecting to hear stories of tactical genius, of battles won and lost, but what they heard instead, over and over again, was a story of disbelief. A story of being crushed by an enemy they had never truly understood. Albert Speer, Hitler's brilliant Minister of Armaments and the man responsible for Germany's entire war production, sat in a bare interrogation room. He was a man who understood numbers, logistics and industry better than anyone, and he was utterly broken. "We had no chance," he admitted, his voice flat, devoid of emotion. "From 1942 onwards, it was already decided. Your production, it was a miracle that we did not understand, and a nightmare we could not stop. We would calculate our maximum possible output for a year. You would produce that much in a month. We would build one complex, perfect machine. You would build 100 simple, effective ones. It defied our entire philosophy." He explained how German industry was a rigid, top-down system. It was efficient in a controlled environment, but brittle under pressure. American industry, he realized too late, was like an ecosystem. It was a chaotic, competitive, decentralized network of thousands of companies, all mobilized by a single purpose. It could adapt, innovate, and surge in ways that Germany's rigid system never could. A high-ranking panzer general, a man who had led tank charges in Poland and France, was asked what he believed was the single greatest American weapon. The interrogator expected him to say the B-17 bomber, or perhaps the atomic bomb. The general shook his head slowly. "It was the 2.5-ton truck," he said, leaving the room in stunned silence. "And the jeep. And the bulldozer," he went on to explain. "We had the better tanks, perhaps, but you had everything else. You had trucks to bring them fuel. You had bulldozers to build them roads. You had mobile workshops to repair them. A German Panther tank was a magnificent weapon, but alone in a muddy field, out of fuel, with a broken transmission, it is just a 50-ton statue. A monument to a victory that will never happen." He looked at the interrogator, a flicker of the old arrogance mixed with a new, bitter understanding. "You did not defeat our army on the battlefield. You made the battlefield irrelevant. You buried us in things. You buried us in your material, your supplies, your sheer, unending, vulgar abundance. The laughter died when we realized we were fighting not a nation of warriors, but a nation of producers, and there is no defense against that. This was the final revenge. Not the sight of burning German tanks, but the dawning comprehension in the eyes of their creators. The realization that they had been beaten not by a better soldier, but by a better system. A system they had mocked, dismissed, and fundamentally misunderstood. The Sherman tank was never a perfect weapon. Even after the war, veterans would argue about its flaws, its vulnerabilities, the friends they lost inside its steel hull. But they would also speak of it with a strange, grudging affection, because for all its imperfections, the Sherman was theirs. It was the machine that carried them from the beaches of Normandy to the heart of Germany. It was their cramped, noisy, oil-smelling home. They gave their tanks names: Barbara, Death Trap, Kentucky Killer. They painted snarling faces on the front and kept pictures of their sweethearts taped to the inside. It was a tank with a soul, because it was so deeply human in its design. It wasn't a pristine masterpiece meant to be admired from afar. It was a tool meant to be used to get dirty, to break, and to be fixed. It was resilient, just like the men who crewed it. One veteran, years later, tried to explain it. You hated it sometimes. You cursed it when it broke down. But you trusted it. You knew that if you got hit, you had a decent chance of getting out. You knew that if a track broke, the mechanics would have you moving again in a few hours. You knew that no matter what happened, there were always more coming. It wasn't the best tank, but it was the best friend you could have in a war like that. It always, always showed up. The legacy of the Sherman is not just in the number of enemy tanks it destroyed. It's in the number of its own crews it brought home. It's in the bridges it crossed, the towns it liberated, and the final victory it helped secure. It stands as a monument to a uniquely American philosophy, that perfection is the enemy of good enough. That victory doesn't always go to the strongest, but to the most persistent. That true power lies not in the quality of a single weapon, but in the ability to put an overwhelming number of good enough weapons in the right place at the right time with all the support they need to keep fighting. The sleek, powerful German Panther is a museum piece, a testament to what was possible. The humble, rugged Sherman is a legend, a testament to what was necessary. So what is the story of the Sherman tank really about? Is it just a story of factories and firepower? No, it's a story about arrogance, and it's a story about the quiet, devastating power of being underestimated. Hitler and his regime were seduced by their own myth. They believed in the idea of the master race, the master weapon, the master plan. They saw their own brilliance reflected in the polished steel of their Tiger tanks. They were so blinded by their own light that they couldn't see the vast, gathering shadow of their opponent. They laughed at America because it was different. It was messy, loud, inefficient, and democratic. It valued comfort over discipline, commerce over conquest. They saw these as weaknesses. They were, in fact, the very sources of its strength. The story of the Sherman is a timeless warning. It whispers a lesson that echoes through boardrooms, through political arenas, and through the lives of all of us. Never confuse quiet with weak. Never mistake practicality for a lack of ambition. And never ever mock the person who is willing to do the hard, unglamorous work while you are busy admiring your own reflection. True strength is not the ability to build one perfect thing. It's the resilience to build 10,000 things that work. It's the humility to admit your flaws and the drive to fix them. It's the understanding that no one wins alone. You win with a team, with a system, with a relentless, unending supply of support, and with the simple, unbreakable will to just keep moving forward. The world is full of people who believe they are the Panther tank, superior, elite, destined for greatness. But history is more often shaped by the Shermans, the workhorses, the underestimated, the ones who win not by being the best, but by being the last ones standing. In the end, it all comes back to that room of polished marble, to the laughter that echoed with such confidence. He laughed at their factories, until those factories outproduced his entire empire by a factor of 10. He laughed at their workers, until the hands of those shopkeepers and housewives built the very machines that sealed his fate. He laughed at their spirit, until he realized the spirit of a free people once awakened is the most powerful force on earth. And he laughed at their tanks. He laughed and he laughed, until 50,000 of them rolled over the ashes of his 1,000-year dream, their engines roaring a final deafening reply. History has a long memory for those who laugh too soon, and sometimes the most complete revenge is not a shout, but a rumble. An unending, unstoppable rumble that slowly, methodically, and completely drowns out the laughter until all that is left is silence.